Hello Kerbonauts, welcome to episode 5 of KSP Fully Loaded. And fully loaded we are indeed, with all the cash that we brought back from the moon mission. And we're using this to upgrade many of the buildings here at the KSC, including the vehicle assembly building for more parts in the editor, the astronaut building for allowing EVAs in space and on other celestial bodies, the science center for allowing to unlock nodes above 100 science, and the mission control for allowing patched connects in conjunction with the tracking center, so maneuver node planning, etc, etc. And now it's time to unlock the sweet science nodes that we like to have, including propulsion systems with those little, I call them satellite motors and tanks, and further down below the advanced electrics, which gives us one more science experiment from the Dmagic mod, and a couple of solar panels, the extendable ones, of course, which are quite neat to have, especially for satellites. Speaking of satellites, we are now setting up with a Kerbal alarm clock all the transfer window alarms for all the other planets, because we might want to send a unmanned probe to another celestial body at some point in the future, and it would be nice to do this on a more conservative fuel margin. So we are trying to use all those neat transfer windows that Kerbal alarm clock is so gracefully reminding us of. And of course we're going to accept some more contracts, and we have accepted one contract that basically says return science from the moon, which we are going to do anyway with our moon strategy. And there was some parts testing on the launch pad, which are basically free cash, so we kind of did them, even though it's very little cash. It's becoming almost like insignificant in its amount, but still it's nice to have. And so we're up now to talk about one of the main events of this episode, which is the launch of this very classy little vehicle, which is a rework of our Luna 1 rocket. You can see that the main tanks and the boosters are a bit bigger, which is because the payload is actually bigger or heavier and a bit longer actually as well. The second stage is going to be almost the same, except that it's going to have those two satellites sitting on top instead of the satellite being integrated into the previous stage. And as you can see, I'm quite aggressive with the gravity turn here, which is going to come back to bite me, because it meant that we had to kind of raise the nose up at this point where we are close to solid rocket booster separation, as you can see here, and we lost a lot of delta V, actually compensating for this for this little navigational error. And this, of course, is the transfer stage, or it's supposed to be the transfer stage, bringing us to the moon with the two satellites on top, which off camera we are now going to do all the inclination changes to match the moon, which we are doing off camera because we've done it in the previous episode. The one thing I wanted to show you is how we are dealing with maneuver nodes in regard to the flight computer, which comes with remote tech. As it can happen, the craft can end up on the far side of a planet or a celestial body where there is no connection to the Earth, and thus meaning that we lose the ability to steer the vessel if it's unmanned. Thus we have the flight computer, which we can program to basically execute any maneuvers that we have set up beforehand. And this is what we are doing here, just for testing, since we are still in orbit around Earth, of course. So there's no need, but I wanted to test it out, and it seems to work just fine, except that we spend too much fuel on our ascent due to this, very aggressive gravity turn, and so we need to spend some fuel of the satellites to get us to the moon, which is really a shame. It's going to come to haunt us later in the mission. And of course, sometimes there's still the odd navigational error, so we kind of have to manually adjust our periapsis around the moon, which you can see here. We are going to set this up for a periapsis of 50 kilometers and an apoapsis of 200 kilometers. Basically a highly eccentric orbit, because these two satellites also have another mission that we would like them to have. As communication satellite, they're supposed to be in a higher orbit so they can cover the planet with the necessary angle. So they need to see more of the planet than they would be able to if they were closer by, but they still need to be close enough so that their antennas are, helpful. However, we are also keeping the closer periapsis here because we want one of the satellites to go back closer to the surface to do some science. However, since we spent some of the fuel already in our transit to the moon, that was basically designed to be for those science mission stuff, we are kind of switching plans a bit, and first thing we do now is to actually secure the primary mission goal, which is to bring communication to the moon. So now we are spending some of that fuel to actually circularize the orbit of the first satellite. Meanwhile, we're doing some high orbit science and sending it back to Kerbal, since we need some more science to unlock some of the essential parts for the moon landing, including lander cans and landing gear, etc, etc. So now we're transferring fuel back and forth because the second satellite, which has the science experiments on it, is supposed to go down again to lower the periapsis again down to the surface of the moon, or closer to the surface of the moon, around 50 kilometers, to do some near orbit science. Of course, we need to set up all the antennas, and as you can see, those satellites have 4 antennas on them, or rather 5. 2 dish antennas for long-range communication and 2 of those foldable ones to cover the moon or any other vessels, and of course communicating with each other, and the 5th one being of course a little communitron to do near-field communication if need be. Yes, and now we've kind of seeing another problem here, since we did include a flight computer, but we only included it on the stage that doesn't have the science. So now we are not quite sure how much delta V we actually have left. This is of course a problem, since we are already running on fumes. We're not quite sure if we are going to accomplish our goal, but since the craft is rather light and the maneuver that is required of it is not that demanding, we should be fine to actually at least try to do the near distance orbit science on a kind of a 50 kilometer periapsis. And here you can see, of course, the connections that we already established to Earth. As you can see, the other satellite working as intended, and now we are close to the surface, or closer to the surface, and now we're using these parts. These parts are coming from the Universal Storage mod, and they're essentially the mystery goo container and the science materials bay that we already know, but in a more compact form factor for satellites like this. And we are actually using this camera that we just unlocked with the advanced electrics to get us some more science. And then there was one more mission that this vessel was supposed to do, and also ignore the shaking, that's because of the overzealous SAS. This vessel also has an antenna to scan the surface of the moon, and the idea behind it was, of course, to find a suitable landing place, to see where there are slopes, where there are rather big plains where we could potentially touch down with another craft. However, this antenna or this scanner only works when it's close to the moon or close to a celestial body. And since we are on an eccentric orbit and the fuel reserves are low, we can only kind of go around the moon descend to a lower orbit, and then actually go up again. And once we go up again, you see the scanner stop working. However, it doesn't work anymore once you are in a high orbit, and then we're coming down again, and you can see us scanning here. So the problem, of course, is that we are kind of flying over all the same areas over and over again, and scanning those doesn't help at all. So basically, because of the rotation of the planet and maybe offsetting some of that height, we might be able to scan all the areas here. However, it would take a ton of time that I decided now that we don't have. So this is kind of a failed part of the mission. So the secondary goal wasn't fulfilled. Primary goal now getting back into focus, which is of course aligning the two satellites in orbit so that they basically have or provide communication all of the time. However, those two satellites are not the only satellites that are supposed to build this communications network. I was thinking about bringing up at least one more satellite, maybe two, one in a polar orbit and one to complete kind of a 3-part equatorial network. As you can see, I'm setting up the second satellite about 1/3 of an orbit behind the other. And of course, this requires us to be very precise with the orbit heights, because of course a little deviation means that the satellites are going to creep ever so much closer or farther apart from each other whenever we do a full circle or the full orbit. And which is not that big of a problem if you're just looking at maybe 10 or 20 or 100 orbits. But as this game is going to progress, we are going to talk about thousands and tens of thousands of orbits, because of course the moon is rather small and an orbit takes just barely minutes to complete. So this is going to be very, very problematic once you have a strong deviation. Of course, KSP in its base form does only allow us to be precise with this on the scale of meters, and this is what we are going to do. For this, we actually have to throttle down the motor of the satellite, to limit the thrust so that we actually can achieve this very, very fine maneuvering capability. Now with this setup, all we have to do is actually point all the antennas to the right places, one pointing towards the moon, one pointing towards the other craft, one pointing back at Kerbal, and one being available for any future communications. Of course, this is very taxing for the batteries, and we included a ton of batteries. You can see them on the satellite being the parts with the gold foil. However, I miscalculated, and all those satellites, both satellites, are essentially not fitted with enough batteries. This means through their flight through the dark side of the moon, they actually spend all their power, about 80%, through the dark side, meaning they stop functioning actually at some point during their flight, meaning of course that the communication network is going to have disruptions. And you can see it here, the satellite losing power, stopping communicating, and then coming onto the light again, and then picking up communications again. This is of course not ideal, and we might have to revisit those satellites at some point. Clearly this mission was kind of a failure. We didn't accomplish total coverage of the moon, and we didn't accomplish our science goals with the equatorial scan. So the idea now was to look at some contracts to get us to somebody to pay for our next flight, and we accepted two major contracts, one being bringing a satellite into an equatorial orbit around the Earth, and the other one being bringing a satellite into a polar orbit and actually scanning the Earth with this scanner that we brought to the moon, which didn't work out. This is the quest we're talking about. It's a very basic quest. Scan 75% of the surface of the Earth with this low bandwidth scanner and collect all the monies. And this is of course what we are going to do, but we are going to start with the more easy task, which is going to be the equatorial orbit. And for this I kind of reworked our rocket again. It's a tried and true proven concept that we can now use to deploy anything around Earth or the moon. And I kind of sized it down because, again, this is just an equatorial orbit around the Earth, so I kind of boiled down the second stage to just contain enough fuel to achieve our main objectives here, and maybe a secondary objective. Of course, going into an equatorial orbit around the Earth from the Kennedy Space Center is not as trivial as bringing something into an equatorial orbit around Kerbal, because the Kerbal Space Center is sitting right on top of the equator, whereas Kennedy Space Center in Florida isn't. It's sitting a bit north of the equator, or a few. Actually, isn't it? It must be something like 1,000 kilometers north of the equator. So you kind of have to adjust for this. There are some launch sites like French Guinea, which is used by Airbus for the Ariane starts, which are so close to the equator that actually inclination adjustments are rather small. For the Kennedy Space Center, as you can see, we kind of have to fly quite some time south and then do the inclination change. I'm pretty sure that the most efficient way would be to just fly east from Florida and then actually do the inclination change once you hit the equator, but for this I wanted to try it out to test my hypothesis and do it the other way around, which is basically fly down to the equator on a southeasterly course and then do the inclination change there. And we're going to check the math on this over the next few flights. This of course now being the inclination change in conjunction with getting into orbit. And again, the ascent stage is not sufficient, which I expected at this point, so we're using the second stage to actually complete the orbit. And the telltale sign of this is of course when the camera starts to move and we kind of know that we are in orbit. Of course we can also read the apoapsis height and periapsis height on top and in the flight computer, but of course, yeah. So, and then we of course are required to match the exact orbit of the contract, which we are a bit too high for. And this is me mucking around with all the maneuver nodes and, you know, changing all this back and forth. And we've done this in the past, so I'm not going to go into much detail here. It's basically adjusting apogee and perigee and using radial and anti-radial to kind of shift the orbit around, and normal and anti-normal burns to change the inclination to match what is required of us by the contract. And this is what we achieve here. And now the contract is complete. We're getting this the cash, and now the second part of this mission begins. We're going to use this satellite as a sort of backup communication device and also to do some more science. As you remember, we unlocked this Dmagic camera, which only works in high orbit around a celestial body, and thus we can now collect high orbit science here with this camera from Earth. And the communication setup here is basically two antennas, the small Omnitron always active, and the other one an omnidirectional antenna that's going to help us out with communication at some point. It's not going to be that important, but since this satellite was already up there, why not use it, right? Anyway, that's basically all we have time for today. Thank you very much for watching. and be sure to tune in next time for KSP Fully Loaded. Bye!